I'll introduce myself and tell you how we came to these people, and they can introduce themselves. Andres and Julie and I were having coffee, and we were talking about the problems of having a blog where you get stuff out. And I have two blogs. I have a personal blog and I have a corporate blog where I have 3 other bloggers, and the 4 of us put stuff out. And as we were talking to Andres, I said, well, I know a guy named Dana Blankenhorn down in Atlanta. And when I was putting together a open source software company, he kept blogging about how to do an open source software company. He didn't know me from Adam. And I kept reading his stuff and said, okay, here's what we have to do next. So we went for 18 months following most of the stuff that this guy said, and we put it together. Carol, I have a long history in COBOL, and Carol was a COBOL programmer. And she got to the point where she said, you know, I've had a career here, but my real interest would be in curing cancer. And she doesn't think she lays on hands or anything, but what she knows a lot about is how you measure data and find stuff out of data that other people wouldn't see. So she started a blog to fund that. And it's been going on for quite a while now, and every time I read it, with Dana's, I just put my hands in the air. A lot of times when Carol does it, I end up going like this because I'm so happy to write. Her most recent post was on Lucille Ball, 100th anniversary, so it was her and Google who covered that. So, and what she's done is she looks at things as an analyst, and she very often comes up with things that are immediately fungible. So I wanted her here because she's about the best analytics person I know. She writes to what the readers respond to, which is kind of fun. How many people went to the journey down the Mekong at Radio Free Asia with the Web Managers Roundtable? Not that many, okay. So we went to Radio Free Asia, and Randy Ryland was running it. And what this was a video blog, starting up in Tibet, going down to the China Sea. And he wasn't really telling the story, he was making the people do it. And we got into July, and I said, I wonder who our 4th blogger will be. And Julie said, don't worry, we'll meet somebody perfect. So it was July 3rd, she calls up, she says, how about Randy Ryland? I said, oh, that's too good to be true. So what Randy did is he started a lot of the social media stuff at Discovery Channel. So it's not just blogging, but it's how do you build an integrated, using the integrated tools, so that you can build a stunning presence. Right? And Dana, why don't you give us a short one on you?
Well, you know, let me, a short one on me?
Sure. How'd you come to be a blogger?
Oh, I've been a journalist just about all my life. I guess I got started when I was 8 years old, and I have dysgraphia, which means my handwriting sucks. And I was getting bad grades in 3rd grade. And my dad, for Christmas, got me a typewriter and a record called How to Learn How to Type in an Hour. Well, being 8 years old, I didn't know you can't learn how to type in an hour from a record. So I did. And within a couple of months, I was going at 60 words a minute, and I hadn't stopped. You know, so I went to journalism school. I always wanted to be a writer. I started writing as soon as professionally when I was 15. And so I've been a working journalist ever since, pretty much. Most recently, well, right now I'm working with Seeking Alpha, which is an investment site. Before that, I was at ZDNet for 5 years, doing open source, health IT. I helped launch Smart Planet, which is their, let's rewrite the press releases site. Back in the 90s, I was considered an expert in internet commerce. I remember the Net Guide. I was working for the magazine, and they brought me up, flew me up to New York, and had them take pictures of me in a suit holding dollar bills. I started writing about the internet online in 1985 with something called News Bites. I was a journalist there for 9 years. And I really got my start in tech in '82 at the Atlanta Business Chronicle when my old editor in Houston came by and said, why don't you write about these high techies, as we call them. So I started out writing features about people who are now historic figures in the business, like Dennis Hayes and Hayes Microcomputers. If anybody old enough to have had a motor, but basically, getting back to what you're talking about, blogging is just publishing. Okay? Just like if you were doing a newsletter, it's publishing, which means you need a business case. Yes, who's your audience? What can you do for them if you have their attention? And can you turn that into something of value? And once you answer those questions, that becomes your business case. Now, some folks you know, they have millions of members, and they may want to activate those members on an issue or get them to give money. And others may just have 100 decision makers, they all want saying the same thing. Both can have a successful blog, they're going to have different levels of audience. Generally, you know, you don't, depending on how many readers you want and how active you want them to be, determines how often and how much you have to post. And in this, the inverse square law of journalism holds. Little tiny newsletter costing $400 a year, it comes out 12 times a year, only this much content. So you may not want to send anything out except once every 2 weeks. If you're just trying to get those 100 people activated. But make sure that that's really solid, good stuff. It's worth that money. If you have a whole, you know, you got a newspaper, the old days, you know, remember newspapers when they were this thick, cost 50 cents. You know, inverse square law applies to blogging as well. I think everybody knows most of the rest of it, but you measure everything and you adjust your strategy based on the measurements. If you're missing your target audience, you know, consider a blog post that's a questionnaire, asking your people what they want, and read the results read the results carefully and let your readers be your guide. IN, internet, actually stands for intimate. Success on the internet means creating what feels like an intimate relationship with people, and then scaling the intimacy. First, you create the relationship, and then you scale it. And that's about it.
Good.
I've talked too much.
No, good. Good start. Carol, tell us about you.
My target audience is boomers with cancer who want to write their autobiographies for their grandchildren. So I know who my target audience is. I know who I'm writing for. And my job is to write to them in such a way that they want to come to me to help them get started writing their autobiographies. The post that Dick was just talking about that came out this morning on I Love Lucy is a tribute to my husband. I read a Parade article last week, or a couple weeks ago, where they were talking about this 60th anniversary of the I Love Lucy show's debut, where they interviewed Lucy on his daughter Lucy, and said, what do you think this is about? I said, well, I think it's about unconditional love. Well, I understand unconditional love. I ruined 2 out of 3 shirts my husband needed to go to his first interview out of college so he could go to work for IBM. And he married me anyway. So I understand that. So all of my blog posts are short stories like that about either me, my children, my grandchildren, my brothers when they were young, that sort of thing, as a prompt to help people think about what they want to write about, what stories they want to tell their grandchildren. Because it turns out it's hard to figure out how to get started. Now I can help people get started, but every blog post is aimed at thinking about that. And I came up with this, I was talking about earlier before we started, about when I wrote my first book. I've written now 7, and the first 6 were all about virtual interviews with the top computer executives of the best computer companies around the country, where I interviewed asking about the culture of the company, sample projects, technology. I was a software engineer for 25 years. Software engineers, number 1, typically can't write, but I could. And number 2, can't explain to the human relations department what kind of people they need for technology positions. So I said, well, I'm a software engineer. I'll interview the top computer executives. I'll write up the virtual interview. When I went to book signings and talked to people about this book, one of the first things that happened was people came up and started telling me about their books that they hadn't written yet, that they really wanted to write, this idea they had that they wanted to put down on paper, and how would they get started? I'm like, wait a minute, aren't you here to talk about me? Why am I having this book signing? But once I understood the process and changed my mindset about what was happening, I realized that I was affecting people. I was getting them to think about their own stories, and so now I'm turning that into, okay, let me help you get started. Let me help you write that story. The cancer treatment started some years ago. I had a friend who was on the hunt for cancer treatment because of inoperable stomach cancer. He found an obscure private science library up in Wisconsin where a scientist formerly with NIST, who had retired to Wisconsin to put all his papers in the private library before he died, had written about a cancer treatment where all the ingredients were available. My friend tried it, 30-pound tumor gone in 6 weeks. He gives me this 1-page protocol. He says, all natural, it will never be patented, therefore there will never be any clinical trials. But it seems to work. And I put it away for 7 years and said, eventually, I can't just leave it sitting in my desk. What if it does work? What if it works for more than one person? What if this is the reason that this tumor disappeared and it can be replicated? And so I went to a consultant who was a pediatric oncologist who used to work for FDA, used to work for NCI, and I said, here's my story. Is there any point in pursuing this? I have a little bit of money left over from my mother's estate that I'm willing to use to answer the question if there's any point in pursuing this. Long story short, she said, you have enough evidence to go get a clinical trial, get permission for a clinical trial. And so I incorporated in 2008, and I'm on that path. And the blog is to help fund that effort. Randy?
Well, I started out as a journalist, a reporter, and then went to magazines, and I was a magazine writer and editor. And one of my favorite things when I was a journalist was serving as a columnist. And in doing so, I had the good fortune and the opportunity to develop a voice. Then I went to Discovery Communications and serendipitously did so in 1995 before a lot of people even knew what websites were, including myself. And I worked there for 14 years, and when I left, I was head of digital media for Discovery Channel. During most of that time, I didn't do much writing at all. But what I did learn was how you can communicate on the web, how it's a very different way of communicating, and this is really obvious, I know, but it was a lesson that I learned that how not to think in such a linear way, and how to be a multimedia communicator. And all the while, I wasn't doing this myself, but I was seeing what was working. What did people respond to? How could you mix these different types of media and tell a story in that way? And one of the brilliant things that the person who started the website, a woman named Rebecca Farwell, did, when she brought in all the first round of producers for the website, which is what they called us, she got a real mix. I was the print person. There was a guy who was a documentary filmmaker. There was a person who had a museum exhibit background. And her thought was, well, we don't know what storytelling is going to be on this platform. Let's just throw this mix together and have people learn from one another. And I learned a lot. I was sitting next to the documentary filmmaker, and he thought visually. I never thought visually. He would start the story with an image, which was a revelation to me. How could you do such a thing? And so through that process, I learned about these different ways to do storytelling. So the last part of my story, or the current one, is now I'm doing consulting work on social and digital media, but I'm also doing a blog for Smithsonian.com on innovation. And last year, I blogged for much of the year for grist.org, the environmental site. I was doing that on a daily basis, and the thing that I was able to do was to take some of the writing skills that I developed, but also merge those skills with what I learned about communicating on the web. The multimedia approach, that it's not all about writing. If you were to say with any corporation or any organization, okay, we want to turn people into columnists, you might as well shoot yourself in the head. It's not going to work. But to say, we want you to be bloggers, that's a very different thing, because you don't have to be an outstanding writer to be a blogger. You can use all these other things to tell stories. You can use some of the really basic, what we call tricks, to engage people. And part of my time in the past was I worked at the Washingtonian, which Washingtonian is famous for lists. We always hated doing them, but that's what sold. And I've become a big believer in lists, because particularly on the web. How many times have you gone to Mashable and the things you read are 10 ways to do this, 15 ways to do this, 5 ways to do this, because it cuts to the chase. You know exactly what you're going to get. And that's the sort of thing you have to think about with the web, and certainly with blogging. People don't want to waste their time. They want to know what they're going to get, and they want you, and the beauty of doing points like that is you don't have to be a great writer. You use your knowledge, and you take the bullet points that you might for a PowerPoint demonstration that you might have, and you present them. So, we can talk more about that, but I think it's been an interesting journey for me. And I'm not, I haven't been blogging that long, but I certainly have learned a lot about the kind of feedback you can get from the community, both good and bad. and how you can prepare for those sort of things that can happen.